Well, thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and it's wonderful to be able to participate in this great conference. So this paper is joint work with Jacob Orchard and Johannes Wieland. Jacob was our student. Now he's at the Board of Governors, so the usual disclaimer applies. So this is a paper I've been thinking about since at least 2011, just saying, I need to write this paper. And we started talking about it and finally wrote the paper. So this is preaching to the choir, which is, we're really interested in marginal propensities to consume for a lot of reasons, but, particularly in heterogeneous agent models. And what we're trying to answer here is what is the marginal propensity to consume out of a temporary tax rebate or any kind of stimulus payment. Of course, for liquidity reasons, behavioral reasons, you can have a higher MPC than would be predicted by the life cycle permanent income model. Microestimates suggest that MPCs can be 50% or above, and we saw some high MPCs yesterday. Now, if you take that and calibrate a heterogeneous agent model, then you can get the prediction that temporary tax rebates can be a powerful stimulus, such as we saw during COVID. Okay? Now, we're going to focus on the 2008 rebates because it's a much clearer experiment, but we have follow-up work. Yes? I know, there's a lot of static, so let's see what we can do here. Let's try this one. All right, let me know if that's much better. Yes, great. I was wondering if you were hearing what I was hearing. Thank you. Okay, so turns out there's a macro tension with regard to the 2008 rebates. Okay, in the summer of 2008, Marty Feldstein, and then just a few months later in January 2009, John Taylor did some very simple analysis of macro data. They looked at saving rates and aggregate series and ran some simple regressions. And they saw a big savings spike and no consumption spike. And they concluded that the MPCs out of that rebate were very, very low. All right? But just a couple years after, Jonathan Parker and his co-authors started with a working paper in 2011. That's when I became really interested in this. They had, just beautiful, impeccable applied micro study where they added rebate questions to the consumer expenditure survey as well as the Nielsen survey. They had a great natural experiment because the randomized timing of these rebates, and they applied micro methods. They were state-of-the-art micro methods at the time, and they found very high marginal propensities to consume MPCs between 0.5 to 0.9, all right? So everybody just sort of forgot the Feldstein-Taylor analysis because this was such great applied micro that Jonathan and his co-authors were doing. Now, there was a paper by Sam Shapiro and Slemrod, and this paper did a lot, but at the very end, it was sort of talking about how big the Parker et al. Estimates were, and they did a little calculation, and later in a discussion, I did extended that for a counterfactual. Let me just show you the updated version here. A big part of the high MPCs that Parker et al. Estimate is for motor vehicles, okay? So what Sam Shapiro-Slemrod did says, well, if you take their estimated MPC, you could kind of calculate in an accounting sense what the implied induced expenditures on motor vehicles are. And they put this in a little table at the end of their paper, and nobody else paid attention to it. But I knew about it because Matthew Shapiro had showed this to me. So what this does is create a counterfactual based on this, all right? So the black line shows you actual expenditures on new motor vehicles during 2008, and it shows you a little bit of time around it. And then it takes that induced spending and says, okay, if we follow this, if we don't do any partial equilibrium, general equilibrium, just the accounting exercise, and say, if there had been no rebate, what would expenditures on motor vehicles have been in the summer of 2008? That's what the purple dashed line shows you. It shows that motor vehicle spending would have declined by almost 90% in this dramatic V shape, and then mostly recovered right when Lehman Brothers is failing, all right? I've studied the auto industry, and for many years. Nothing like this has ever happened before, all right? So this is why I had been thinking about this for a while. And unfortunately, Johannes and Alistair had their wonderful paper on durables, and everything came together. Okay, so how do we reconcile those micro estimates with the macro counterfactuals? So are there other factors that could have led consumption to be lower in May and July than in August and September had we not had the rebate, all right? We provide narrative evidence, we provide forecasts, professional, our own. Nothing suggests there should have been that V-shape in the summer of 2008. A second possibility is measurement error in aggregate personal consumption expenditures, all right, particularly at the monthly level. And Jonathan Parker had made this argument to me a number of years ago. We look at alternative ways to look at this, retail sales, we aggregate up the consumption expenditure survey, and then the same point that I made to Jonathan, I said, motor vehicles are always well measured, so it's not a measurement error issue there. We go through that cannot explain it, all right? What the national income and product account is picking up in terms of what happened to actual is exactly, very close to what you get from alternatives. Now, that was just a simple accounting exercise I showed you. So what about general or partial equilibrium dampening? What we're going to suggest is, because a lot of that MPC was motor vehicles, is that, you know what? There's an upward sloping relative supply curve of motor vehicles, okay? And what that will do is that makes the general equilibrium MPC, allowing for all the feedback effects, less than the micro MPC. Now that will help a lot, but it doesn't go all the way. What we also look at, and this is one reason why we started on this paper and we couldn't quite figure out what could be wrong with the micro MPC estimates, and then we figured out because of a flurry of new research in econometric methods, which is that the standard OLS diff and diff or two-way fixed effects treatment tends to bias things in a lot of situations, and that overstates the micro MPC. And what we do here is, the problem is it uses previously treated households as control groups, and I'll give you more detail if I get to that part in my talk. And we use the new method by Borchak, Haravel, and Spies, their diff and diff estimator, and we get a 40% reduction in the MPCs using the same data as Parker et al. And I should say that Gianluca and Greg actually noted this issue. They told us last summer, and we went back and looked, and they had this wonderful experiment saying, are they really using the right control group? And this is, before this literature even got started. So we're following up on that as well. Okay, so let me start take you back to 2008, all right? So just a review of the data and the major economic events. All right, so details of the 2008 rebate. It was passed in February 2008. Most funds were distributed between April through July. It was $100 billion, which was equal to 11% of January disposable income. That's at the monthly basis. 85% of what are called tax units received some non-zero amount, and it was phased out at higher income. And then among households receiving a payment, the average payment was $1,000. It depended on how many children you had and all of that. All right, so if you look in the data, well, this is the rebate, it's huge, and this is the timing, and almost 50%. So as I said, it was passed in February. A little bit was sent out in April, but almost 50% was sent out in May, with still some, quite a bit sent out in June, and then July, and then it goes back to normal. In the following graphs, you're going to see that same red line for May 2008, so that you can just see how things look relative to that. All right. Here's disposable income and consumption, all right? And I'm showing you both real and nominal. So the nominal is the green line, and we see, a big spike in disposable income. So it's big relative to the aggregate, so you see that spike in the aggregate data. For consumption, you see an increase, and these are even though the the y-axis is adjusted, it's the same scale on both. So you can see that there's an increase in nominal consumption, but not as big as the other. But then if you look at real, you still see that big spike in the disposable income, but you see this little tiny hill in the blue line for consumption expenditures. And if you look by product, you can hardly see anything there. And then if you look at motor vehicles, you don't see very much there either. Okay. Now, why is there such a difference between the nominal and the real? It's because of what was happening to inflation. So this shows you total PCE inflation with the blue, with the diamonds, and then the green excludes food and energy. So this is actually not inflation, this is the price index, all right? So prices are rising, and the rate at which they were rising was accelerating going into 2008. They then plateaued, this is later on when Lehman Brothers is failing, and then they actually fall, the price level, so that the price level at the end of 2008 is about equal to what it was at the beginning of 2008. Now, excluding food and energy lets you know that a big part of it, again, was because of oil prices. So excluding food and energy, the rise in inflation in prices is much more gradual. And the graph over there shows you what was happening with energy, goods and services. They were shooting upwards, and then they fell like a rocket, I guess you could say. All right? So energy prices were a significant contributor. So when you look at the real things, you only get the little bump in consumption. All right? Now, something else that's really important for our dampening effect is what happened to the relative price of new motor vehicles in that summer. So the blue line shows you the trend from about August 2007 through April 2008, before those big payments were made. And the black line shows you the relative new vehicle price. And this is using the BLS series that also uses private data, so you have many more observations. And look at what happens right after that big chunk in the red line of rebates are given out. Motor vehicle prices shoot up and then down, which suggests that supply curves might be upward sloping. Okay. Now, what was going on with the behavior of monetary policy? So the nominal federal funds rate was coming down, and then after the employment report for December 2007 that came out in early 2008, the Federal Reserve became very worried and started lowering the federal funds rate, in fact, even between meetings. And then they paused after the stimulus payments went out, and then continued lowering them when Lehman Brothers was failing. The real ex-ante rate looks similar. Obviously, it's at a lower level, and we use the Michigan consumer expectations. The real rate basically went below zero just as the stimulus payments were coming to the economy. All right, so we don't see a lot of funny things going on with monetary policy. It's just how you would expect them to behave. All right, now, do any forecasts at the time suggest that there would be a V-shaped consumption path? So first, we look at professional forecasters. They too became much more pessimistic after the release of the December 2007 employment report. Some were predicting rebates, but using past behavior of Congress, they were saying that it probably wouldn't be passed till the second half of the year. Nobody expected it to be passed so quickly. So some of them predicted rebates enacted in the second half of the year. And then I'm going to show you a graph that shows forecasts made them. I don't have time to talk about our forecasts, but we try to become even more pessimistic than the professional forecasters by taking our own perfect foresight that oil prices went up so much in the summer, whereas the professional forecasters weren't forecasting that. We also had perfect foresight that Lehman Brothers was failing, and even then, we cannot get a much more pessimistic forecast than the forecasters. So what were they forecasting? So here's a whole bunch of them. The dark green is the Green Book forecast. This is for consumption. they were forecasting sort of a slowdown in the growth rate of consumption, but overall, the path was slightly upward, all right? That was in 2007, also similar for the Green Book forecast from January. The blue is actually the median surveyed professional forecasters forecast. That was just, consumption would continue to go up. Some of the most pessimistic, well, let me just say the minimum surveyed professional forecasters one is that blue line. But you can see a slight dip there, but it's just minuscule relative to the other sorts of numbers that I gave you. And I always kid, that must be Nouriel Roubini, the only one who was really pessimistic about things. Goldman Sachs, among the big groups, was also quite pessimistic. But you can see the actual real consumption path looked like that and then started declining in the last quarters of the year. Okay, so there's just nothing suggesting there should have been a V shape where you get, a contraction in that second quarter and then going back up. All right, so we're going to think about allowing for general equilibrium effects to see what happens to these V shapes. So we're going to create macro counterfactuals, and these are basically historical macro counterfactuals. So what we'll do is construct a medium-scale, two-good, two-agent new Keynesian model. It's going to have non-durables and durables. We're going to have optimizing and hand-to-mouth households. We'll have sticky prices and wages, non-competitive labor markets. It's basically a combination of the model that I used for my infrastructure chapter, which itself is an extension of Jordi Gali's 2007 model, and then it's merged with Mackay and Wieland's econometrica durable goods analysis. Okay, we're going to calibrate. One of the reasons we do a two-agent model is because it's so easy to calibrate the MPC, because we're going to do experiments for a lot of different MPCs, just by calibrating the fraction of hand-to-mouth agents. We're going to simulate the response of consumption to rebates, okay, that have that same timing as what they actually had and the same size relative to the economy, and then look at that simulation relative to steady state in our model, and then use that percent deviation and subtract it from the actual consumption data to get the counterfactual path. Okay? Let me just show you a couple of equations for the model, because otherwise everything's quite standard. So the utility function of both types of consumers, they care about non-durable goods consumption. They care about the flow of services from durable goods, D, and then hours worked to have this utility. Okay? And we allow for different exponents on each of those. All right? Durable goods accumulation is DT is a real stock of durable goods. XT is durable expenditure denominated in non-durable goods. So if you want sort of the real flow, say the number of cars into durables, we divide by the relative price of durable goods. It's just the way we set this up. We've got a standard depreciation rate, 1 minus delta D. Right now, and we're still working on this, when we calibrate our model, we want to match both the elasticity of intertemporal substitution for durable goods, and this is for the optimizing households, as well as the intratemporal elasticity. With the standard model, you cannot match the estimates from the literature for both of those. So you've got to have some kind of wedge. In the summer, we had an convex adjustment cost, and we got really good feedback from Gianluca's group, including people who were on Zoom who later emailed us. They said, that's going to screw things up. Sorry about I'm doing this. And they were right, because we went back and looked at it, and that's what was giving us W shapes rather than V shapes in our thing. So for right now, we're just having this sort of stochastic additional depreciation that's trying to pick up these things. The key is that's not time shifting things like the other one was, and what we want to do is find a simple way to have sort of a fixed cost, which is what we're really trying to pick up. But we've already started looking at things, and it's not going to change the timing of things as far as we can tell. Durable goods production, all right? So for simplicity, rather than putting an entire sector with its own Calvo pricing and all of that kind of thing. What we do is we assume that you can use non-durables to produce durables, and that's given by this supply curve. And the supply elasticity of these real durable goods is given by the zeta inverse, all right? Now, if zeta inverse is equal to infinity, then non-durable and durable goods are perfect substitutes in production, which is basically what you're implicitly assuming if you just have a one-good model, all right? So household behavior, we're going to have a fraction 1 minus gamma of optimizers. They receive all the profits. Then there's a fraction gamma of hand-to-mouth consumers. Now, standard models assume they neither borrow nor save and simply consume all their current income. However, we want to match some of the stuff in terms of the timing of the spending that Jonathan Parker and his co-authors found. So we're going to allow for lagged effects of an income shock spread over a few months, calibrated to the micro MPC evidence, okay? And it's just, instead of consuming everything in 1 month, we're going to let them do it over 3 months, basically, okay? So we're actually going to assume that they spread this spending equally over 3 months, beginning with the current month. The best estimates, this is from Broda and Parker, using the Nielsen data where they had more high-frequency data, was actually 2/3 of the spending occurred in the current month, with the 1/6 in each of the next 2 months. By assuming just 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, we are making our counterfactuals less V-shaped, so we're weighting the case against us on this, okay? We assume that households allocate 83% of that extra expenditure to durables, and that's going to be that's based on estimates that I'm going to present at the end, because a big part of the MPC was the durables expenditure, okay? We calibrate the durable adjustment cost elasticity of substitution to match long-run demand elasticity of -1 and a short-run durable demand elasticity from Bachman et al. Based on the value-added taxes. All right? So our baseline supply elasticity is going to be infinite. So this is what is usually assumed implicitly. And then we're going to have a less elastic alternative, although still very elastic, and that's equal to 5. Okay. So we're going to use our two-good tank model to simulate the dynamic general equilibrium consumer spending responses I told you. We're going to match the anticipation lag, the size, and the timing of the actual rebate. We're going to run the experiment for micro MPCs equal to 0.3, which is similar to Shapiro and Slemrod's estimate and our new estimates, and then also 0.5 and 0.7, which are in the low to midpoint of the Parker et al. Things, because they go up to 0.9 even with some of their estimates. Okay, we can show 0.9, but it just makes the graphs look weird. All right, so here is our counterfactual simulation for the baseline model. The left hand just shows you the micro MPCs. So that is what I was showing you before with that V shape, except that now we're allowing a little bit of smoothing over the 3 months. The top is total consumption expenditures, and the bottom is motor vehicles, all right? And you can see in both of these cases, you get these pronounced V shapes, and you even get them with the micro MPC of 0.3, but even more so with 0.5 and 0.7, and then 0.9 would be even more V-shaped. Again, you're seeing this recovery, right when Lehman Brothers is failing. The right panel shows you the general equilibrium equivalent, so for consumption. So at the top, that's for total consumption. You can see that in this kind of model, you actually get amplification. All right? The V shapes are even more pronounced because that's what a good new Keynesian model does. It amplifies things, all right? So the problem gets worse over there. The same thing with motor vehicles, all right? So you put it in general equilibrium, and the puzzle is even greater, all right? And if you look here, say if you have a micro MPC of 0.3, the GE MPC goes up to close to 0.4, and then because of nonlinearities, if you have a micro MPC, say a 0.7, the GE MPC is double it, all right? Same with motor vehicles. You get the same kind of little bit of amplification for the lower MPCs, but more so as the MPC goes up, all right? So as I said, the puzzle's even worse. All right, so how do we reconcile these? Okay, so what we need is some kind of significant general equilibrium dampening forces. Now, one could just take the standard model, say, I'm going to lower the friction elasticity, I'm not going to allow so much capital utilization, I'm going to make a Federal Reserve be less accommodative, all of those sorts of things. But we actually think, given the prominence of durable spending among these MPCs, is that and what that relative price tells us, let's see what happens when we allow for a less than infinite elastic supply of durable goods. So we're going to change that elasticity from infinity to 5. Okay. And then so first I'll show you these results, and then we're going to go on to a re-examination of the micro MPC estimates. Okay, so here's the counterfactual when we have the less elastic durable supply. So the left-hand panels are the same micro MPCs I showed you before. So those are exactly the same. The right-hand side is in our amended model where all we've done is made durable goods supply less elastic. Okay. Suddenly, the V shapes just become much less, all right? And in particular, if you look at when the micro MPC is 0.3, the blue line, that actually looks similar to the sort of forecast that we had shown. For motor vehicles, it's the same again. It doesn't look so strange, particularly with the micro MPC of 0.3. You still get some V shapes as you let the micro MPC get bigger, but 0.3 seems to get rid of that disconnect between the micro and the macro. All right. So if we look at the numbers, so remember when we had a micro MPC before 0.3, we were getting a GE MPC of 0.4. Now it's dampened down to 0.2. Okay. Before, when we had a micro MPC of 0.7, in the baseline model, it was doubled up to 1.4. Now it's basically 0.7. All right. So even with that very high micro MPC, we're just not getting any amplification or dampening. All right. And similarly for the motor vehicles and the non-durable goods. Okay, so relatively elastic demand for durables is important for dampening. And with only the micro MPCs, that's wrong. With only, yes, this is important. Suppose that we amend the model and there's a table in the paper so that we only have non-durables in our model. We don't get this dampening then, all right? So if you have only non-durables in the model and the micro MPC is 0.3 and it's all on non-durables, your GE MPC is 0.4. You still get the amplification because now we've just taken out the durables.
I think you said something like 83% of the spending was on durables. Is that something you calibrate to? I mean, in steady state, it's only a relatively small share of total spending. Or are households choosing the durable, non-durable mix? Or are you kind of forcing them to spend on durables?
No. The 83% is the spending on the we're basically, this is not a general, think of our calibration as not sort of a general thing. All spending is always going to be 83% on durables, but rather during the summer, the increase of those spending their checks, 83% of that tended to go to durables. So that's what we're hitting there, and it's not the steady state value. Okay, so yeah, thanks for the question. Okay, so there's some lessons for Hank models, all right? So the addition of durable goods is crucial for our dampening result because durables have more elastic demand than non-durables, all right? So when you start looking at these partial equilibrium relative price forces, which then go into general equilibrium, it's really important to keep in mind how the optimizing households respond to those changes in prices in equilibrium. And they're going to respond much more to a 1% price increase for a durable good than they will for a non-durable good. So that's why we focus so much attention on that elasticity. So the increase in durable price means that the optimizing households intertemporally substitute away from durables. The hand-to-mouth households are basically robots in our model. You know, you give them a dollar, they're going to split it one-third, 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 and they're going to do 83% of that on households. Obviously, that's a simplified approximation to what's probably really going on, which is some people are buying, you know, a car, an entire car, because they got enough from the stimulus check to put a down payment on it. You know, and so that's something to think about in the future, but we don't think that that messes up our counterfactual. All right? So both the overall MPC and the distribution of spending across goods matters for the GE outcome because of this fundamental difference between non-durable and durable goods. Now, as I mentioned, if we calibrate the MPC to 0.3 in a one-good, non-durable model, we still get implausible counterfactuals because the general equilibrium forces still amplify things. And so our little message here for thinking about MPCs and spending on stimulus is that heterogeneity of goods is as important as heterogeneity of households. Okay, so we've gone far, but why are we focusing on 0.3 when Jonathan Parker told us that, you know, the MPC estimates are 0.5 to 0.9? What we're going to show now is, oops, did I do, wait a minute, somehow, sorry. What we're going to do now is talk about our new estimates, and then this is going to be the second part of our reconciliation of micro and macro. Okay? So we're going to focus on the indicator specification of Parker et al., and that's because the Borischer, Harvel, and Spies, which from now on is BJS, because there are three different languages, trying to pronounce their names correctly is hard. So it's BJS is the great team for the econometrics. Okay, so the Parker, their method only works with an indicator method. All right, so Parker et al., it's the same kind of specification that people have used for decades to test the permanent income hypothesis, and they've always used this for the rebates. So you look at the change in consumption of a household, say in period T+1 relative to period T. They put in month fixed effects, you know, for each month for their whole sample. There are some control variables in X, and then there is an indicator according to whether they received a rebate that month. All right, so that beta 2 is a key parameter. C is consumption expenditures, as I said. And of course, because it's the consumer expenditure survey, you have all of these complications where they're only interviewed every 3 months, even though they're reporting what happened in the previous 3 months. There are fixed effects, as I said, and then the household controls that they include are for age and change in household size. And then, as I said, the rebate. Okay, now they were just running that with ordinary least squares was the way thousands of papers in Applied Micro was doing it at the time, okay? But then people have figured out that there are some issues with that, you know, who would think? Because you have a randomized treatment, how could you go wrong? Well, it turns out standard two-way fixed effects effects, which later on I noticed in the table I should have put it here. That's going to be called TWFE, okay, estimators, assign weights under the implicit assumption of homogeneous treatment effects, which is that everybody is going to respond to that rebate similarly across the months. Now, it turns out these weights are inappropriate when treatment effects are heterogeneous, and the object of interest is the average effect on the treated population, the ATT. So we use the BJS method, which is very clever because it imputes a counterfactual spending paths based on untreated and not yet treated households. So let me get, somehow the graph, I noticed that the graph that we used, let me just make sure, yeah, the graph that we used last summer disappeared from this presentation. Here's the idea, is if you're doing the standard method All right, so remember, 50% of the households received their rebate in May. And then you had some more in June and July, and then it petered out. Meanwhile, we're looking at the consumer expenditure survey where people are interviewed in, say, September about what their spending was 3 previous months. Okay? Suppose the MPC is positive, all right, and higher than the permanent income hypothesis says. Then consumption will go up, for a lot of households, will go up in May, okay? And then will go down afterwards. So we're going to let them, it's going to go down afterwards, all right? Implicitly, that simple OLS estimate, when it's then looking at the MPC for the people later in the summer, it is implicitly using the previously treated people as the control group. But remember, those guys had a high of consumption. Wow, we got our check, and then they're coming down. So the control group is saying, oh, for people not treated currently, consumption growth should have been negative. So when you look at that difference between that small positive of the people who were treated in, say, July or were interviewed in September, your control group is saying that there's this big bunch of people who have negative consumption. That's why you get the upward bias, all right? Now, because also of the heterogeneity in the treatment, it's not enough to put in, lagged rebates and lagged consumption, all right? Because otherwise, if it was homogeneous treatment, you could just put those lags in and you would be okay, all right? So BJS have this very nice method. What they do is they estimate a regression on the households that were never or not yet treated observations, all right? And because they're not getting a rebate, there's no rebate in there. So it's the same equation that Parker and them use, but there's no rebate indicator because none of these people are receiving it. You then use the fitted values to impute the change in consumption for all observations as though no rebate were received. Then you create this difference for each household, which is their actual consumption, minus that imputed change in consumption had they not received a rebate. All right, so you're using the control group right, and then you just take the average of that. Okay, so let's see what happens. All right, so the top is what Parker et al. Used, the two-way fixed effects. Thousands of people had used it in their papers. All right, so you get an estimate on the rebate indicator. Remember, the average rebate was about 1,000 of 483. And if you use the fact that the average was 1,000, we do that with the second regression, you get an implied MPC of 0.52, okay? Now, if you put in a few more controls than they did, it actually goes down some, down to 0.35, because we had just tried some controls, which is interesting. But if you look at the rebate-only sample, and this is where Parker et al. Get their huge 0.9, close to 0.9, you get an implied MPC of 0.86, all right? So that's where their estimates come from. So then we apply the BJS estimator. So here, on the rebate indicator, the coefficient is 287, not statistically different from 0. The standard error really isn't any bigger. It's just that the size of the coefficient shrunk. The implied MPC is 0.3. If we put in controls, we actually get even less, 0.12. But again, even with this great natural experiment that Parker et al. Looked at, you're still getting uncomfortably big standard errors. But 0.12 is small. Now, when we try to do the rebate-only sample, shouldn't be a surprise once you think about it, we get gigantic standard errors. It looks like these huge MPCs. But why is that? Because as time is going on, there's hardly anybody who hasn't gotten the rebate. So you just don't have a good control group, all right? So our estimates just are not worthwhile there. And we also do it for subgroups. Now, we can look at the weights that you get and the treatment effects for the two-way fixed effects versus the BJS estimator. And the black is the treated versus the not yet treated, and the red is the past treated. The estimators aren't that different for June, or July or August, what happens, it really shows up in September, because remember in that September interview, they're asking about those 3 previous months. There's this big weight on the past treated, and that's what's pumping up the MPC and the two-way fixed effects estimator. Okay? All right. So to summarize, when we look at total consumption expenditures and the full sample, two-way fixed effects in the standard case gives you an MPC of 0.5. With the BJS, we get an MPC of 0.3. And I should say that BJS, in their paper, actually do a little application, and they do it to Broda and Parker's MPC estimates using the Nielsen data. We're using the consumer expenditure survey, and guess what? The MPCs shrink by 50% in that case. All right, so both sets of estimates see this big shrinkage. Most of the change comes from non-durable expenditures. We were surprised by this. According to our TG tank model with less elastic durable goods supply, a micro MPC of 0.3, where 83% of that goes to autos, corresponds to a GE MPC of 0.12. Okay, and I'm trying to remember why that's this. That number might not be quite right. I think that should be a little 0.2. Since there's a negligible investment response to the temporary tax rebate, our model is a closed economy, the GE MPC is approximately equal to the Keynesian multiplier for output, because consumption is the only thing changing. And so this suggests that the multipliers on these rebates were probably 0.2 or less. And when I say multiplier there, I'm saying, MPC over 1 minus MPC kind of thing. All right, conclusions. So we've used a two-good tank model calibrated with the micro estimates of the 2008 rebate to create counterfactual consumption paths. Based on narrative events, we argue there's just nothing to suggest, had there been no rebate, that you would have had a V shape in consumption in the summer of 2008. And I showed you forecasts and all kinds of other things going on. Now, two possible reconciliations that we look at. One is that the GE forces dampen the stimulus effects of these high micro MPCs and or upward bias in micro MPC estimates. We think that it's a mix of the two, all right? One thing you could think is you got to get rid of the V shape, all right? You can do it by dampening things more in your model or by shrinking down those micro MPCs. You almost have an indifference curve. You can choose what mix you want. We chose it, tried to do it based on the data, but you've got to hit to not have those implausible V shapes. You've got to be somewhere on that curve, all right? So both of these imply smaller multipliers because that particular isoquant I just talked about has to do with the aggregate multiplier. Okay, so more broadly, we propose this new method for evaluating microestimates. If you're looking at an experiment, such as the one that Marios talked about for Chile, check what those estimates imply about what the counterfactual would have been had there been no payments, all right? And I've done it before with Gabe Chaudhary-Reich's ARRA, suggesting ridiculously big increases in unemployment during the Great Recession had there been no Obama stimulus. And we're also looking at the 2001 rebate now and a number of other cases. So we think that this is useful, kind of a reality check on all of our estimates, and then they can help us guide our models and make us dig a little bit deeper to see whether there might be something wrong with the estimates there. Okay, thanks.